Welcome to African Roots, brought to you by DW. In this podcast series, we discover how individuals from across Africa shape the continent. I'm Laila Johnson-Salami.
And I'm Cai Nebe.
Cai, I have got a question for you. Are you the cultural type?
Well, hold on. What do you mean a cultural type? You know, like museums, or what are we talking here?
Yeah, I mean, that was a pretty broad question. I mean, like art, sculptures, music, you know, the kind of things that make life worth living. Are you about those things?
Oh, you know, when you're trying to get away from news, politics, sports, I guess you could say I do dabble a bit in the cultural side of things, yeah?
Well, you should, because I would really like you to meet someone.
What do you mean, like right now?
No, silly. I mean, for the African Roots podcast, someone for us to share with our listeners this week.
So for our listeners, Laila and I have spent the last few weeks researching and looking at different characters and personalities from African history who have had a significant impact on the continent. You know, often good and sometimes not so good.
And, you know, for some, we have to go way, way, way back in time, like this one. And I can say, though, that while my guy that I'm going to be introducing today lived over 5 centuries ago, part of his legacy is really a hot topic between two unlikely contestants. And those two contestants are European museums and independent African countries.
Well, that sounds like a strange clash over there. Well, take us through, Laila.
Right, but when I say way back, I mean 5 centuries back, okay? And we're in the Benin Kingdom of West Africa.
Oh, Laila, but you do know that Benin is a country, right? I mean, you being from Nigeria, I thought you, of all people, would know that.
Well, a little distinction here, Kai. So there's a country called Benin, yep, and it's west of Nigeria. But I'm referring to the Benin Kingdom, which was in the territory of today's southern Nigeria. So there's also a Benin City, which is even further away from Benin the country than Lagos. So we have a lot of Benins that we can talk about. But today we're going to be focusing on the Benin Kingdom. But let me not digress too much. The man that I'm going to be introducing you to today is Oba Ewuare, Oba Ewuare the First, actually, who ruled between 1440 and 1473.
Quick question there. Oba Ewuare, is that his full name or how is it?
Well, not per se. So Oba actually means king, right, in the Benin royal family. It's still active today. Ewuare II is the current Oba of Benin. He was crowned back in 2016. Also, while the royals' role in contemporary Nigerian politics may be regarded as largely, you know, like ceremonial, they do maintain huge cultural importances in the country, and they do also have a huge influence, Kai, on state politics.
So what you're basically saying is that being a king is still quite a big deal then, right?
Yep, it surely is. It really is. But, you know, according to scholars, Oba Ewuare I was the one who really solidified the Benin Kingdom's line of succession.
Benin was never the same again by the time he left. You can talk of the history of Benin before Ewuare I and after him.
So that's Abolade Adeniji, a professor of history at Lagos State University.
Once he came, he stabilized the kingdom. He introduced some administrative changes.
Now, one of those changes was, and, you know, this may seem quite obvious at first, that a king was to be succeeded by his first son.
Wait, hang on. So how did they decide who was going to be king before then?
Well, to be honest with you, Kai, there were no clear plans, apparently. And rival groups did also fight for power, including Ewuare. He violently overthrew his brother in a coup that left Benin City in complete ruins. However, Ewuare's change after he did become king sort of guaranteed peaceful transitions from one king to another. Prof. Adeniji again.
Well, you could talk of advantage in terms of stability. You know that once a king dies, the so-called qualified princes begin to war among themselves, which was what he also experienced anyway. You remember his own brother too had usurped power and all that. From point of view of stability, it has a very huge, advantage, which you hardly find elsewhere. And ironically, it has survived till now, unbroken. It's unbelievable.
So to this day, that rule holds true. And was Oba Ewuare then quite a ruthless leader?
Well, not per se. In fact, quite the opposite. So after picking through the rubble, Oba Ewuare had Benin City rebuilt into this wealthy and prosperous empire. But one of his most visible legacies is the Benin bronzes.
These Benin bronzes, are these the ones that are currently in many European museums, and there's been quite a lot of controversy around the fact that they're there?
Yep, absolutely, Kai. I was in Cambridge in the United Kingdom for this event where the first ever Benin bronze was being returned to Nigeria from a British institution, which is historical. It's never happened before. And the younger brother of Oba Ewuare II, who's the descendant of Oba Ewuare I that we're speaking about here on African Roots this week, he was there to actually receive the bronze to bring it back home. And Kai, I can't even tell you the emotions that were in that room that day, having this bronze that had sat in Cambridge University, by the way, handed to the university by the father of a student over 100 years ago, something that clearly belongs to Nigeria. There was a lot of power in it coming back home, but I don't want to digress too much. You see, Oba Ewuare I, he really, really loved the arts, and he introduced the Igwe Festival, which is still celebrated till today. Now, he also really encouraged the training and crafting of artwork too. So specifically, he's credited with commissioning the famous bronze heads, and he did that as a way to honor the deceased Benin kings.
He patronized the arts, sculpture, ivory, this bronze casting. He actually encouraged these traditional sculptors, okay, and with his encouragement, they were able to give out their best. And some of the products, that were developed at that time have remained till now.
So Oba Ewuare is basically the guy behind these famous bronze heads. And how exactly did the Benin bronzes end up in the United Kingdom or in Europe? I mean, because it's a very long way away.
So you see, when European colonists arrived in Benin City, now they arrived in Benin City in the late 1800s, they looted many of the treasures that they found, Kai. The racist view at the time was that Africans could not have made the Benin bronzes because the quality of these artworks surpassed almost anything that had been seen before. Just picture that, just try and imagine that, right? So in fact, there were many things that colonial forces found in Benin City that didn't align with the imperialist perception. So city walls, a street lighting system, it was seen as revolutionary, and they genuinely saw it as incapable of being attached to the black person.
And so that was all there when they arrived. I mean, what happened afterwards?
Well, it was all there when they arrived, and I mean, Benin City was largely destroyed by the colonists, but the famous bronze works are still made today.
What? They're still being manufactured, or are they made in sort of on a one-by-one basis?
Absolutely, Kai. They are still being made till today. Let's feature someone who actually makes these Benin bronzes. We're back in Benin City on Igun Street. Now, this is where bronze casters and sculptors produce their works. In fact, that's what Eric Osamudiam and Ogbemudia is doing right now. And he feels his expertise owes a lot to Ewuare I.
Oba Ewuare was, a great man. Oba Ewuare the first was a great man. During his reign, 1440, he created an avenue for artwork to be known, Benin artwork to be known. So that is what we are still holding on to. If he has not opened up that, that chapter, maybe Benin artwork or artifacts wouldn't have been known all over the world.
So it seems that Oba Ewuare I still lives on in a way in Benin City, I guess.
Yeah, but it's not just that, Kai. So over the last few years, we've seen heated debates over the presence of these looted Benin bronzes that are unbelievably still sitting in European museums, Just recently, Germany did agree to hand back some of the Benin bronzes. Like I mentioned before, the University of Cambridge also handed back recently the first ever Benin bronze that was stolen by a British institution. Another one was also returned recently from the University of Aberdeen up in Scotland. We also know that France have been keen to return looted Benin bronzes too. So you can see this shift and this push. But there are still several calls for museums in the UK and other European countries to give back the existing art still in Europe to Africa.
I wonder if this shift has got to do more with the passage of time, or if there's actually also been a shift in the thinking of people around these stolen artifacts, Laila.
I mean, you can definitely see that it's a bit of all, but the political will that's needed to really ensure that all of these artifacts are returned, I don't know if it's really there yet. You know, it's one thing to return one or two stolen artifacts, but you've stolen tens of thousands. So there's still such a long way to go, right?
And I guess the Benin bronzes are sort of one of the more famous artifacts. It's hard to imagine probably what else is still lurking in those museums that have been almost forgotten, I guess, over time. When we come back, we'll meet a politician and art lover who really tried to bridge the cultural divide and paternalistic relationship between Europe and Africa.
DW African Roots. Find new African Roots episodes on dw.com/African Roots, Spotify, iTunes, and wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to African Roots. I'm Cai Nebe.
And I'm Laila Johnson-Salami.
Laila has just told me about the Nigerian royal Oba Ewuare, who changed Africa's art landscape forever. And in response, I would also like to introduce someone, Laila, but he's a little bit more contemporary.
I am intrigued, I must say. Who is it, Kai? I know you've been dying to tell me all this time.
I'm going to introduce you to Leopold Sedar Senghor. Now, this is a guy of many, many talents. He's synonymous with the movement for advocating for black pride and identity. He led his native Senegal into independence. And Leila, I can't believe this is also true, he was a poet at the same time. And here he is actually honored in a song by his official griot, Yande Kudu Senne.
That's the way I know Senghor, Senegal's first president, right?
Definitely not wrong. That's the first thing a lot of people think of. One has to think, though, that he was an intellectual, a man of literature and culture before becoming a politician. He was born in 1906 in Senegal, which of course at that time was a French colony. And he was born into quite a wealthy family for the time, when French West Africa, which used to be a huge federation, was actually being solidified.
La moitié de mes poèmes ont été inspirés, je ne dis pas seulement par le Sénégal, mais par deux.
Half of my poems were inspired by two districts where I spent my childhood. Those are Finla and Joal. I drew the inspiration for the themes of my poems in my childhood and my land.
De mes thèmes poétiques dans mon enfance et dans mon terroir.
For Senghor, who was a really bright scholar, France seemed to be the place to continue his education, for him to move forward in life. So he sailed there in the 1920s to go and study.
Being black in France in the 1920s is certainly not the easiest thing for anyone. Were there many people like Senghor in France at that point in time?
There was a black diaspora in Paris at the time. You know, many people from the West African colonies had, like Senghor, moved to Paris. And this section actually would become critical in Senghor's life as an intellectual and how he thought about Senegal's place in Africa and also the world. He is actually one of the thinkers behind a concept known as Negritude, a movement which he defined as summing up all of the cultural values of the black identity at the time. And this wasn't such a popular thought process at the time because the cultural scene and the sciences at stage were obviously very much dominated by the West, as well as people from Europe who, as you know, were the colonial masters across Africa.
what I can kind of make out about Senghor is this man who wasn't going to really let anyone dampen or try and overshadow his voice.
Sure, especially in France, which, like we've said, was the colonial master and it was benefiting from its presence in Africa, so it was, of course, in its interest to stay there. Negritude was a concept that was viewed with suspicion, but at the beginning also not really taken seriously. Senghor himself wrote hundreds of letters in the press and articles as well as poems that were inspired by his ideas around negritude. Senghor was actually granted French citizenship and he actually managed to excel within the French education system.
When you hear about these build-ups of certain characters in history and how they evolved and they transformed, you just know that it had to lead somewhere.
Not at the start and also not in France. But according to journalist Mame Les Camara, who specializes in political leadership in the media, the importance of culture and identity were very much the things that shaped Senghor's ideas of how a government should be run.
He wanted to make culture something bigger than just some sort of a government addition. He believed culture was at the beginning and the end of all things. He believed that development was not possible if it was not in the frame of culture. That is to say, if culture was not ahead of and after all things.
Fast forwarding a bit to after Senegal has become an independent country, Senghor is the leader, but he has not forgotten or has not abandoned his ideas of the importance of culture in shaping a country and how the country thinks of itself. So he was actually the one who organized the first ever World Festival of Negro Arts in 1966. Now that name, the World Festival of Negro Arts, it sounds so jarring now, right?
Yep.
But at the time, this was the marquee event for what were known as black arts at the stage. And it was also a very successful event. And it kind of was something that Senghor built his own image around. However, his concept of politics didn't really suit everybody in Senegal.
He had his own conception of culture, which had a lot to do with the support he expressed for the Francophonie. In fact, he worshipped French people. I think that is why there was such a gap between him and the majority of Senegalese intellectuals.
Even though Senghor ruled Senegal for 20 years as president, it was not without difficulty. From the outset, there was a rift between him and opponents because of misunderstandings, ideological differences, and generational conflicts.
And why was that?
How to say this? Senghor was a lot more France-centric than many of his contemporaries. Early on, he actually supported the idea of Francophonie, which saw Senegal remaining tied to a French Commonwealth. And when it became clear that decolonization would happen across Africa, it wasn't really clear how this idea of Francophonie would actually work, considering the post-colonial interests of many African states.
20 years as the president of a country, right? There's no way it's not going to end up being without difficulty. That's just such a long time to be in power. Cai, so given all of this, and what you mentioned as well about, his support of Francophone ideas, etc., can one say that Senghor was not necessarily a Pan-Africanist?
It's hard to say this exactly, but I do think Senghor envisaged Senegal's future a lot more tied to France than other leaders at the time. You see, Mali and Senegal were actually tied together to form the Mali Federation, which again would have maintained ties with France. But when this federation failed just a year after its creation in 1960, it negatively impacted Senghor's reputation. Here's Ebenezer Sedegan, an international relations historian from the University of Abomey-Calavi in Benin.
Un rêve brisé pour toute l'Afrique occidentale, l'Afrique de l'Ouest.
It was a big disillusionment for all West Africa because the people who created the Mali Federation in 1959 were in favor of the Pan-Africanism movement. The Mali Federation would have been the founding base for the United States of Africa. Kwame Nkrumah and Sékou Touré were the most famous champions of this vision.
Qui étaient les chantres donc de cette vision de l'Afrique.
You know, Kai, I must say, it does seem as though, how do I put this? It does seem as though a lack of pragmatism got in his way. But did this ruin Senghor's reputation?
I wouldn't say ruin his reputation. For many people today, Senghor still evokes a sense of pride for Senegal. He also became one of the few leaders in the post-colonial era to resign from his post as president and ensure a peaceful transition of power here.
And you know, that's really important because even in the modern day world, I mean, we have presidents and world leaders that still don't resign or finish their terms in power. And hey, a poet for president at the same time.
That's where we will have to leave things for today on our podcast series, African Roots. The project is a cooperation between Deutsche Welle and the Gerda Henkel Foundation. Special thanks to our producers Michael Springer, Maya Braun, and Philip Zantner. Additional research came from Robert Ade and Sam Olukoya. I'm Kai Nebe.
And I'm Laila Johnson-Salami. Join us again next time.